It's my great pleasure to introduce Rachel Swaby, the author of Headstrong and its YA adaptation, Trailblazers. Headstrong was inspired by a New York Times obituary for Yvonne Brill, a brilliant rocket scientist whose obit privileged her stroganoff over her scientific achievements. The Times issued a correction and an apology, but Rachel wondered how many other women and their contributions were being overlooked or overshadowed. So she profiled 52 of them in Headstrong, not only celebrating these scientists, but providing models for young girls interested in studying STEM. And then a quick personal story. I gave a galley, which is an early edition of the book, to my cousin when she was applying to colleges. She was being pressured by her parents to look at programs in the humanities, but she really wanted to study STEM. And last week, her research was cited in a scientific journal, so she chose STEM, partially because she was empowered by Rachel's book. So it's just a testament to the power of these kinds of books in classrooms and for people who are trying to decide what kind of career they want to pursue. And anyway, Rachel is a journalist who has written for Wired, The Atlantic, and Runner's World. Most recently, she hosted and produced a narrative nonfiction podcast called Human Race. Please welcome Rachel.
So nice to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Okay, so Claire kind of stole my thunder a little bit. I was going to ask you about the beef stroganoff. Could you explain to us about that?
Yeah, well, it was a big thing on Twitter, too. A lot of people got really outraged about it. In 2013, as Claire said, there was this obit that started off. Yvonne Brill made a mean beef stroganoff. She followed her husband from town to town, and she was the world's best mom. And that was the first paragraph of the obit, and I don't know, I probably wouldn't have kept reading. But the second paragraph said, oh yeah, she was also a rocket scientist, maybe the only woman working in rocket science in the 1940s. Oh yeah, and she also designed a propulsion system that keeps satellites in orbit. And you're like, why are you not leading with this incredible accomplishment? It seems like that should be up top. And actually, the outrage on Twitter and elsewhere made the New York Times go back and rewrite the obituary so that, you know, in the first paragraph, they mentioned, oh yes, and she was also a brilliant rocket scientist.
That's right. If you check out the obit now, it's reversed.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's so exciting. So what prompted you after that to go on to choose the 52 women?
Right, so after that it was really, I found myself really frustrated. I used to work at Wired magazine, and so I really loved writing about science. And I kind of felt like we should have better profiles of women in science. If we're just getting the obituaries and they're written kind of not as well as they should be, it seems like we should have kind of a better exposure to the amazing women who have worked in science. So we picked 52 women, which was just like heartbreaking because there are so many amazing women who worked in science in history. Everybody in the book is dead, but even then, they're just like so many women we could have chosen, and so it was really hard to kind of figure out who was going to be included. So the way that I kind of sorted it is I was looking for stories, because for me, reading about somebody's scientific experiments or what university they went to, it's hard for me to kind of really grab onto that and hold it and use it in my everyday life. But if I get kind of the story of somebody's life and their discoveries, then it's easier for me personally to remember. So I thought that might be great. So the kind of criteria for inclusion in the book is that it had to be dead, which was kind of sad. Also, I had to have enough information on their life that I could actually write that story, not just where they went to school and what their discovery was, but kind of how they made their discovery and kind of how they got through the system. And then the last is because there were so many people that I could have included, they had to have a really kind of fundamental thing that they did, not just the first woman to attend X university, but someone who kind of made a concrete discovery.
So something I noticed in reading your book was almost all of the women had so many roadblocks, and they really persevered to get to where they were going. What kind of message do you want to send with both of your books?
Yeah, about the roadblocks, what really stuck with me afterwards is just how many times the people in the book had to be told, were told no. And so, no, they were not able to get an engineering degree. No, they were not able to get a job that paid them. No, they were not able to use an office. And the kind of creative ways that they had to kind of get around these problems. So, okay, they couldn't graduate in engineering, so they went into chemistry, or there was too much discrimination in chemistry, and so, there were no women in engineering, so they tried engineering instead, or they couldn't have an office at any university, and so they set up a lab in a janitor's closet. Just the truly creative ways that people were able to do their work. And that, I don't know, I feel like if I had people at every pass telling me that I couldn't do something, I probably wouldn't get to where I wanted to go, but just how creative people were in taking those no's, thinking okay, this no doesn't actually have anything to do with me, I'm gonna find a way around it, and how much success they were able to find by not listening to the people who told them that they couldn't accomplish what they wanted to accomplish.
So in choosing the 52, they're all women, obviously. We said they all had roadblocks. Were there other common threads? You said that they all were dead when you wrote about them. What sticks out in your mind that they all shared as well?
Yeah, there were a couple things. First, just how much creativity was in kind of the science and the math and the kind of how they did their work. So for instance, one of my absolutely favorite women included in the book was Rita Levi-Montalcini, and she was Italian and Jewish during World War II, and so she was not able to work anymore, and so she had to go into hiding. And she set up a lab in her bedroom, and she made a scalpel with a knitting needle, and she got a watchmaker's little scissors and miniature forceps, and she would ride her bike down the street, and she would ask the farmer, oh, I need chicken eggs for my babies, they're hungry. And so she'd get these chicken eggs. She didn't have kids. She dedicated her life to science. So she'd take them back to her lab, and she'd do her experiments in her bedroom lab. And what she published afterwards, another scientist in the U.S. saw, and then she traveled to the U.S. and had a great career and was a Nobel Prize winner. And it just true creativity. And there's a mathematician I love who just kind of approached her math in such a creative way that it really inspired me. I always thought of math as a really kind of just a memorization thing. I'm not a scientist. I didn't study math and in college. And she said that it was a mistake of the uninformed to confuse mathematics and arithmetic. Arithmetic is just a pile of dry and arid numbers that you add and subtract, and mathematics is poetry. And I was I love poetry. That makes so much, and you really see in her work just how flexible and creative she was, and she was so successful in that way, and I really wished that I had.
Talking about Rita, the Italians wouldn't publish any of her work, so she had to send her work to Switzerland and Belgium to be published, which for all of us to think that because she was a woman, any of her work that was done, if she was a man, would have been published immediately.
Yeah, and so she had to think really creatively to get her work out.
Right.
And so that's just another example of the crazy things that people had to do to be able to do.
Right. And then
they were passionate about.
she formed a partnership with Cone, and that's in 1986 when they won the Nobel Prize for
Nerve growth factor.
physiology.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Unbelievable, right?
Yeah, and that was like her whole life's work. She had spent decades at this point working on it, and yeah, it's an amazing story.
So your women are from all over the world. How did you find them? Some of the people I've never heard of. How did you find them?
Yeah, so I kind of went into this and I'm like, I worked at Wired magazine, like I have good, of course I'm gonna know a bunch of these people, and I swear now looking at the book I knew maybe 5% less, and I was really dependent upon other people's records. So for instance, there's one story in a book in that I knew about because somebody that this woman had worked with when she was young, she died pretty young, and a lab partner of hers got kind of older. An agent thought, if I don't write down her story, no one's ever going to hear it. And so I was really dependent upon records, online records that were held at universities, or other people's records of these women's lives. And you just think like, okay, if I was only able to find somebody because of their university archive or because of somebody else's great work, how many women were lost? How many women's research was lost because they didn't have somebody that thought, oh, I'm getting older in age, I need to write down their contribution before we don't know about it anymore. So, I just really felt as I was going around that this was just the tip of the iceberg. And some people in the book, I was really frustrated that I only learned about them as late as I did. For instance, there was a seismologist that I didn't have included in the book in the beginning, but then someone dropped out just kind of the last couple of profiles I had. I couldn't get enough information for someone, so I thought, I'm going to look at, I'm going to kind of do some more research. And I found out that this woman had discovered the inner core of the Earth. And I was kind of pissed because I was like, I learned about this when I was in elementary school. Why was her name not attached to it? Sorry. I feel like there are a lot of women in the book whose discoveries are like pretty easy to understand, like big things like the inner core of the Earth, pretty easy to understand, that it would have been great if I had known about them and if other people had known about them when they're learning this stuff in elementary school and high school, because then you see like, oh, it's not just Einstein on the wall making these amazing discoveries, but
we talk a lot about science. We're all science supervisors here. I've taught earth science and never knew that Lehman discovered the inner core.
Yeah.
Until I read your book. And now I can't wait to go back to all the earth science teachers and say, you have to include this in your lessons, We want to encourage women. So how do you think we can use your book to encourage more women to get involved in STEM and science? Andy mentioned that his mom was an electrical engineer. Mm-hmm. My daughter is an electrical engineer. I'm an AP of a science department. You wrote about women in science. How do we get more women in the traditional men's areas?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways, and I'd be interested to hear from you as well. But one thing that I think would have been helpful for me, because I'm not a scientist. I always loved the sciences, but then when my last year in high school, I felt like, oh, well, I don't know if this is for me, and for some reason I took myself out of it despite doing really well. And it wasn't until later in my career that I started working at Wired, and I'm like, I still really love the sciences. I just didn't go into it because I felt like there wasn't a place for me. So I think one way that I think that we could get more exposure for a kind of larger range of people making discoveries, like women making discoveries, is to attach their names in the textbooks. There's so many things in this book that I had learned about in elementary school and high school and even college, but I never knew like the APGAR score. I had no idea that
That was
Virginia
amazing when I read
APGAR
about that.
was the person who did, like, it just, if we kind of tied these things to the people who discovered it, I think that's a pretty easy way to show
Right.
how many women made these amazing discoveries.
Well, I think also with the movie this year, Hidden Figures, that brings up
Yeah.
a lot as well and ties into what you're trying to do.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, I did notice that out of your 52, Marie Curie is not included.
Truth.
Would you like to share with us why?
Yeah. So when I started working on this project, I had just moved to Brooklyn from California, and there was a stoop sale across the street. I guess that's a thing that happens in Brooklyn.
That's a big deal in Park Slope.
Yeah, apparently. So I go over, I'm trying to meet my neighbors, and they have this deck of cards, and it's like, famous scientists. And I was like, oh, I had just figured I was writing this book. I'm like, oh, I'm going to pick this up. It'll be like this thing I'm going to do to start off the book. Fan it out. Marie Curie is the only woman. The only one in the 52 people. I was like, are you kidding me? And then I started talking to colleagues. Again, I used to work at Wired, and so these are like really smart, wonderful people. And I'd say, oh, I'm working on this book about women in science. And they'd go, oh, great, Marie Curie. Over and over and over, every single time I brought up the book, she was the only name that people said. Like, it was just infuriating. And I think that, like, growing up and going through school, maybe her picture was on the wall. Maybe she was the one woman mentioned. And so my hope with this book is that, sure, you can keep Marie Curie because she is truly extraordinary, amazing person, but also that maybe we should broaden our references. So the next time somebody says something about women in science, you could say Inga Lehman, or you could say Sophie Kovalevsky, or Virginia APGAR, or any of these other amazing people that we should also be talking about.
So someone I thought was interesting was Alice Hamilton. You want to tell us a little bit about her?
Sure. So I love Alice Hamilton so much because the way that she did her science kind of made me think of a reporter. One of my favorite, I start the story of Alice Hamilton off with that she was a pathologist, and she, a friend of hers was like, oh, I'm kind of dealing with this court case, and I was wondering if you could help. What was happening was that these store clerks were selling cocaine to kids coming home from school. And it became a problem because, the first time it's free, but then you have to pay for it. So then there was like a wave of crime. And so these crimes were kind of going to the courts. And they needed some way to prove that cocaine was actually cocaine. So Alice Hamilton figured out how to do this test that would prove if it was cocaine or not. And she first put it in a rabbit's eye. Oh, so the test, but the test didn't differentiate between the synthetic version and cocaine actually. So the lawyers found the loophole and people were getting off. And she was like, okay, well, I know that cocaine dilates the eye and the synthetic version doesn't. And so she brought rabbits into the court and did the test on rabbits to show the jury. And the jury was not happy about it whatsoever. They were like, don't show me these rabbits with the dilated pupils. That's like inhumane. So she's like, fine. And she did the test on herself. So she said at some point she would just walk around the lab and all of her colleagues are like, oh yeah, that's just Alice Hamilton with the crazy dilated pupils because she's doing the cocaine test again. And she finally was able to like prove her point. But she went on to look for kind of dangerous things in manufacturing like lead. So she did this whole year-long study trying to figure out what industries use lead and how they were using it and the effect on workers, because really there was nothing that was being done to protect workers at all. And she became the foremost expert in industrial health in the United States, which was actually a problem for Harvard because Harvard wanted to hire the foremost expert in industrial health, but she was a woman, and they weren't hiring women. They weren't even letting people into the medical school. So they reluctantly hired her, and with a couple of stipulations. They would not let her into the university club. They would not let her claim faculty tickets to the football games. And she could not walk in commencement. But she says otherwise it was a very warm welcome.
Which, that was a common problem for so many of these women, that they worked in universities, but they were not given credit.
They weren't being paid for their work.
They weren't paid, they weren't given professorships. The struggles.
Yeah, so people would work their entire careers in a lab, in a university, and never get 1 cent of it until they'd win some kind of big prize.
Right, exactly. And, so Alice ended up being a consultant for GE, a medical consultant for GE, which really set the stage for that kind of position for industry. And she really began that for all of the industry in the United States.
Yeah, and thanks to her, there are regulations that help make sure that workers aren't exposed to lead and all of these other things.
Oh, that's great. So is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
Well, I'd like to ask you, what do you think we could be doing better to share the stories of women in science and to get more girls interested and sticking with it?
I'm not sure. Why don't we open that up to the floor of science supervisors? What can we do?
I mean, I think it was really interesting to hear from Andy about who his father was and who his mother was, like the influences that kind of impacted this. Oh, thank you. The influences that later influenced him becoming a writer, and then you have a better context for how he became a science fiction writer. And with some of these women, you start off a lot in their adult lives, and I'm wondering, what was it that inspired them to go into science in the first place, despite all of the challenges?
Yeah, I found that a lot of people had a really wonderful mentor and that supported them. And guided them, and when they were told no at a very early age, were there to kind of find or brainstorm ways around the system. Some people were just so driven by it that they were going to find a way on their own, but at a young age, having somebody that supported them and inspired them and believed in them seemed to be really important.
Yes, my other question is about, did you notice that there were some countries that were much more women-friendly? So almost like now we have people moving from certain parts of the world to other parts of the world to experience some type of freedom in terms of pursuing their life's dreams. So for women, was there any countries that were kind of known for being more, acceptable of women at that time?
So this is everybody's dead, so this is like a while ago. And I gotta say that the limits of my research, when I got into other languages and resources that weren't translated, I was not able to kind of pass that barrier. So my view is pretty limited. But I would say that there was kind of a renaissance in Germany before World War II. A lot of women were doing great work and were accepted in Germany. And then, the majority of the women are from the U.S. They also had a very hard time, but were able to make it through.
So I was just going to answer the original question, like
Yeah.
how do we permeate women in science, right? And I loved physics in high school and I loved math, but I didn't know what that would look like as a career outside being a mathematician or a physicist. And I was good at both of those things, but I think it's our job to tie, studying these subjects, what are the possibilities, and they are attainable, and how do we get especially women to go into those fields? I don't know, that's, I think, something that I think about as a supervisor on a daily basis, okay, my kids are interested in this, how do we get them to see the jump from this class to what they could be in college and after?
Yeah, I think something The Martian was really good at is like showing the enthusiasm for the sciences in kind of real life applications. You know, like it was so exciting. And I feel like, especially in math, when I was learning math a long time ago, like I had no idea what the practical applications were, and I've been kicking myself ever since. You know, I really wish that I had gone further, and it would have been so good in so many different ways.
Hi, I just wanted to say. That's right. Rachel, first I just want to say thank you for your efforts. That's a wonderful start. And I would also want to agree with you in terms of The Martian and in terms of Hidden Figures. Movies help to motivate young people and seeing the applications of science and mathematics, engineering, so on. And you know, they're celebrated in movies, science.
Yeah.
And then it also shows the struggles they've had. But
Totally.
whatever the case, movies, our kids go to the movies, everybody loves movies, so
Yeah.
that would be a great thing to highlight some of these women in movies, in a movie.
In answering your question, I think one of the key things that we need to do, one is supervisors and as the educators that are here, we need to tell this story for the unit or within the unit, not wait for Women's History Month and then we bring up the women scientists. You know, as we start covering different topics, bring it up. If it's something that's happening in the literature field, the English teachers can also bring up, so what, it's a scientist, but still they experienced something. Here's women's rights movement, and look at these women who were struggling. Bring up their stories and actually talk about it so that the kids can kind of see these people struggle the same way that I'm struggling or that my parents struggle, and they'll take an interest in it. When I was coming up, and I'm sure a lot of us, everything was males, you know? I mean, especially I was diverted, not, you know, to go into the home economics region as opposed to the sciences. So these kids have a lot more going for them, a lot more exposure, but we need to, as educators, bring it into the classroom. And this book really opens up a major door where we can now start finding ways to integrate it into our curriculum.
I think all of us, if you read this book, there is, thank you, a woman that we can bring into almost every content area that we teach in our high schools. If we share these stories and bring them in, just as I said about Lehman being brought into earth science, Apgar, she's the one who came up with the test for every baby that's born to see if they're healthy. And I didn't know about this. I didn't even know about Hedy Lamarr, that she was a scientist. And it's amazing. And I think I'm a fairly well-read person, and I didn't know so many of these scientists that they were female. And if we start out as the supervisors reading this book and sharing the information with our departments and have a trickle-down effect, we can start having that effect, just as all of us have supported us in being in science.
The 500-pound gorilla in the room, a good follow-up to Trailblazers is the fact that with three-dimensional teaching, students' access to the desire to be scientific is the questions that they ask. And I don't know if there's anyone in this room who remembers a person named Sheila Geist back in the, would have been the late 80s, early 90s. She ran a course on how to become more conscious of paying attention to the questions that girls ask in your class and how to encourage that. The use of scientific practices and concepts and cross-cutting concepts, teachers can encourage questions based on the kinds of cross-cutting concepts that are available to any given lesson. And when you do that, don't take all the questions from the boys. It's that simple.
Great, thanks.
You know, everybody is talking about how we can weed this in, and I think for years, good teachers have always taken anecdotes and woven them into lessons, but I think Andy hit on something before, and it's taking some of the issues these women face, particularly the scientific issues, and posing them as word problems to the kids, and asking how they would come up with possible solutions, and then show what the women did to solve it. I think it's another way to get them thinking creatively about what you do when you don't have all the doors open to you.
Yeah, that's great.
Hi, I'd like to share some research. It's called Draw a Scientist Test, or DAST, and you can administer it to your students at the beginning of your science class at the beginning of the year. And most students, when you ask them to draw a scientist, the research states from elementary through middle school and high school that they will draw the stereotypical white male in a lab coat, crazy hair, and glasses. And when you address the students and say, why didn't you draw yourself? They take a step back and say, well, I don't know. And say, well, you're in this class, you're a scientist, because you're collecting data, you're doing experiments. And it really makes them take a step back and really examine their role in your science class. You can look it up online, there's all the research and the results, but it's really interesting when you give it to your own students.
Yeah, there's also research that like women, when they're kind of making this decision, will, approach some kind of tough problem, might get a little stuck, and think like, oh, well, this is proof that like I don't see myself on this lab bench. This is proof that I can't get this immediately, that there's not a space for me, which is not the same way that boys approach it at that age. And so I think especially in this like high school decision making, like getting that encouragement that, in any career, like Andy said, you put in your 10,000 hours writing, like in any career, it takes a long time for you to get the experience to be at your comfort level with any certain thing, and kind of having support at that really important time seems important.
Is there someone that you wanted to include but weren't able to get enough information, like any one particular woman who really struck you as being unknown or unappreciated? But
So my spreadsheet for this is like 150 people. And it just, I just go through like, and there were lots of people that didn't have enough of, I couldn't find enough research to kind of fill it out. The other heartbreaking thing about this is because everybody in the book is dead, opportunities for women of color opened up much, much later than opportunities for white women. And so I had a very hard time finding like women who'd already died, women of color who'd already died, because there's a lot of amazing research and a lot of amazing researchers now, but they're still alive. Like the subjects of Hidden Figures are still alive. I'm like, I don't want to be crossing my fingers for that, but it just did kind of limit my ability because those opportunities opened up so much later that a lot of the women are still alive.
So Rachel, was the 52 you had the best research for, or did you choose 52 for a reason, one a week?
Yeah, one a week, or that deck of cards that I started out with. Like, at some point I was like, maybe, I could replace all of these men with women, but we never ended up making a deck of cards. But they're really kind of easy, quick, fun profiles, and I thought, if you read one a week, then you'd have like a pretty good history of women in science in the past.
Any fundamental difference we should know about the difference between HEADSTRONG and Trailblazers?
There's no cocaine in Trailblazers. And I did start Trailblazers with had a great editor that kind of Trailblazers was started kind of with their young lives. So there was kind of a little bit more of a focus in each profile on the young lives, which I thought was actually really great and smart. And there's in Trailblazers, because of kind of the age group, a lot of the physics, the people who focused on physics were taken out because it was too high.
So the Trailblazers is written more on a middle school level?
Yeah, it's middle grade. Yeah, middle grade.
And Headstrong is more high school level?
It's an adult,
High school,
right,
yes, well.
high school, everyone book.
I consider high school students adult.
Yes, yes,
level,
yes.
so, yes.
Yeah.
So what's the next book going to be?
My next book is actually not about women in science, but it is about a trailblazing woman. It's about this 13-year-old that broke the women's marathon record in 1967, and then got so much there was so much stress put on her in the papers because there was like, so she broke the women's marathon record as a 13-year-old, and because so many people were upset about it, like 3 years later, she stopped running altogether and never ran again. But it's a pretty great story, so.
So when can we look for that?
Probably like a year and a half, something down the road. I haven't even started writing it yet, but yeah.
Do you plan on doing any more books on women that are alive?
I would love to do that. It's still just like drives me crazy. I would love to do that. So I think there are a couple projects on the horizon where I'm going to try to get at that, because it was just infuriating going through it. Yeah.
Rachel, what is your educational background?
I was an English major. I always wanted to be a writer. And then I got into magazines, and I ended up at Wired magazine, which really kind of changed or kind of clarified the trajectory of my career, because I really loved writing about the sciences. And now my focus is like amazing women, because it's the best.
Do you think you would do a sci-fi novel about, a scientist woman or women somewhere in the universe?
I mean, that sounds amazing. I'm not sure I'm the right person to do it.
To mix a little of that fact with fiction.
Yeah.
So, put it together.
Yeah. Well, ask me again in like 20 years. We'll see. Yeah.
Any other questions?
All right. Thank you so much.
Rachel's going to be